Hello, I'm Ben Vaughn, the host of The Many Moods of Ben Vaughn, and just recently I had the honor, thrill, and privilege of sitting down with Rob McKuen, a man in the 60s who was ubiquitous. You could not turn on a TV, go into a bookstore, watch a film, or listen to the radio without being exposed to Rob McKuen's work. 25 books, 55 vocal albums, 10 spoken word albums, 12 concert albums, and 14 classical albums, as far as we know here with our research team, and he connected on a personal level with millions of people worldwide. The image of Rob McKuen with disheveled hair, wearing a sweatshirt and tennis sneakers was branding before branding. But in the early 80s, Rob McKuen disappeared from the public stage and has only returned to performing and publishing poetry in the last 10 years. In fact, his latest book, A Safe Place to Land, is considered one of his best. But as I prepared for this interview, I became more and more curious about when and how Rob McKuen found his poet's voice. So in the words of Dylan Thomas, I decided to begin at the beginning, chronologically. But before I play our interview, I'd like to present this musical overture, a short medley of 4 of Rod's most well-known songs: Seasons in the Sun, Love's Been Good to Me, If You Go Away, and Jean.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons in the sun, but the wine and the song, like the seasons, have all gone. I have been a rover, I've walked alone, hiked 100 highways, and never found a home. Still and all I'm happy, the reason is, you see, once in a while, along the way, love's been good to me. There was a girl in Portland. If you go away on this summer day, then you might as well take the sun away. All the birds that flew in the summer sky when our love was new and our hearts were high, when the day was young, the night was long, and the moon stood still for the night bird's song. If you go away, ne me quitte pas. If you go away, ne me quitte pas. Jean, Jean, the roses are red, and all of the leaves gone green, and the clouds are so low you can touch them, and so come out to the meadow, Jean, 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 you're young and alive.
Sitting here with me is Rob McKuen, someone I've been a fan of for a long time. I'd like to
Thank you, Ben.
say hi to you and thank you for sitting here in front of me. And I have a lot of questions to ask you.
Shoot.
And the first would be, you have known that you were a poet for a long time. And if you could describe your childhood leading up to your discovery of poetry or your discovery of needing to write poetry.
Well, I was... First of all, I was a kid who was pretty much on his own from the time I had less than 4 years formal education. And so I used to haunt libraries and learn that way. I remember when one summer I spent the summer at my step-grandfather's house. And it was an old house in Alamo, Nevada. And underneath the wallpaper was newspaper. And that's kind of how I learned to read. At night, I would just scrape the wallpaper off and see the paper. Well, there were all kinds of, in those days, there were short stories by people like Jack London and things like that, only mid-chapters. And so later I'd catch up with those things in libraries. And my grandfather was a co-conspirator. He brought me straight pins and we put the wallpaper back so my grandmother couldn't see it. So I was pretty much self-taught most things. I always had a need to, I guess, get things out of my system on paper. It seemed to me that life was much easier to live if I could understand it. And I could understand it if I could see it and reason it out. Does that make any sense?
Sure, yeah.
It's probably why I never ever needed a psychiatrist. Because if I could get it out of myself, it's also why I suppose I don't have much of a private life. People feel they know me because I'm pretty much what I write about.
You were born in a unwed mother's home.
I was born in Salvation Army Hospital. They used to have these ads. There was a Booth Memorial Home, and they would say, any girl in trouble or in seek of help, please call such and such a number, Booth Memorial Hospital. And it was a hospital in Oakland, California. And years later, I wrote a book about trying to find out my identity, who my father was. And I was able to find the doctor who delivered me. He said, oh, yeah, I remember you guys saying, I was in my journal, there were about 5 kids that day, $5 a pop. And there it was, April 29th, 1933. And my mother could have taken all kinds of courses, I guess, but thank God she decided to keep me.
Yeah.
She was an incredible woman.
And you moved around a lot.
I did. My stepfather worked for the WPA. It was during the Depression. And so we went where the jobs were. He was what was called a cat skinner. That's a guy who drives a tractor, levels down dirt to make highways and roads. And so we went where the roads had to be. So I traveled around Washington and Oregon and California. And
were these work camps where you lived with?
Some were work camps, yeah. And sometimes we lived in abandoned houses and things like that.
So was there a lack of education in those towns or setups?
There was in most of them. And when I would go to a town, I would always enter school where I thought I should be. And I say, well, my papers will catch up with me. Of course, they never did. So I was always kind of at a disadvantage. I had to grow up in a hurry. I never knew my multiplication tables until I found out people were cheating me later in life.
So
I learned by doing.
So moving around a lot, I guess it was hard to make new friends everywhere you went. So
It was tough. I usually was friends with older people. The females in my life, the male friends I've had, have always been older than me. Can't get much older than me now. But they always have been. I gained a great deal from older people. And they looked out for me. When I was a hobo and I was a bum, getting from one place to another on freight trains, the older guys looked out for me and kept me from the man, the guy with the rod, the railroad bull, who, if he saw you, beat the hell out of you with an iron pipe. So I was lucky. I never thought it was hard. Nobody told me it was hard. I guess looking back, it might have been. I guess it was, sure. But not really. I wouldn't trade it.
You ran away from home at 11 the first time?
Yeah, to get away from my stepfather. He was a mean man. I spent some time in reform school as a chronic truant. I dug graves, I dug ditches. I worked in a rodeo. I herded cattle. I worked as a rodman on a surveying unit. Any place where the job was, I went.
And how old were you when you were a rodeo rider?
Oh, maybe 15 to 17, 18, something like that.
Oh, wow.
I was pretty good. Not as good as some. Got bucked off a lot. My especially with calf roping, and that's tough.
During this time, being a rodeo rider or working like as a lumberjack, these are not antisocial jobs. You're around people, you're conversing.
Yeah, but there are not a lot of kids around. not a lot of kids.
Did you feel isolated, and is that where you started writing?
Not really, but I felt that there was a lot going on I didn't know about. And there was a lot inside of me that I had to get out and get on paper, because then I could see it and relate to it. That's how I became a writer. And I write every day of my life. I don't always keep it.
Now, were there influences on your writing back then, or did it kind of just come out of your...
I think over the years there have been all kinds of influences. I mean, I liked everything from Walt Whitman to Dr. No. I liked English literature. I liked the Bronte sisters. I liked haiku poetry. I dabble in different kinds of religions, so I became a kind of a religious scholar without really knowing it. But no religion ever satisfied me. I'm kind of a heathen at heart.
And you were also a big music fan from day one.
Always.
Yeah. Does that drive you? Almost everything you do is music a real driving force?
Everything has music in it. Everything does. It's one of the ways I learned mathematics, because music is very mathematical. So, yeah, music makes me turn. There's always music going on. And some of my best songs have been written while I've been walking, because I like motion. I love motion. I love a sense of motion. It's probably why I like trains so much, why I wrote so much about trains.
And when you were a teenager, were you hopping trains? Were you?
Oh, sure.
That's how you would get from town to town, and then try either a lumberjack job
Absolutely, yeah.
So a classic drifter in that sense.
Absolutely, definitely.
But the kid, you're always the kid.
I was always the kid. I was probably always the youngest one, And, but it was odd, the older people really didn't take advantage of me. Not any more than I wanted to be taken advantage of.
Do you think it was because it was a different time? And the Depression kind of brought everybody together in that way?
Maybe. But I was always pretty much an adult. I never really had much of a childhood. I never enjoyed people my own age that much. I was really kind of a sissy. I remember once my stepfather asked me my choice for a Christmas present, whether I wanted a sled or a blackboard. And I said a blackboard. He beat me up. All my friends had sleds. I could use their sleds, but I wanted to write. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
It's interesting, a rodeo rider being called a sissy, but okay.
Well, and the toughest job was really log jamming. You dance logs down a river. That's tough.
That sounds like a tough job.
That's a hard job, and it's a dangerous job.
Any injuries during these jobs? Did you have any injuries during any of these?
Oh, sure.
Physical jobs?
Minor injuries, broken legs, broken arms, stuff like that. Things you get over.
Now, by the time you were, I'm guessing age 18 is what I'm guessing, you had a radio show in Oakland.
Yeah, I did.
How did you end up going from rodeo riding and reform school and log jamming to having a radio show in Oakland?
I finally convinced my mom to leave my dad, my stepfather. And there had to be some place where she and our real younger brother, Billy, could settle down. So I came back to California, and...
you started reading poetry on the air.
Yeah.
And how did you think that would, in between records, is that how you did it?
Kind of, yeah. Girls stood me up. I went on the radio and talked about it. And the phone lit up. I was on this little jerkwater station in Oakland called KROW. Suddenly I had a hit radio show.
So that was sort of the prototype of what you ended up doing later, music and then words.
Yeah. And kind of invented the spoken word album.
Yeah, romantic poetry.
Yeah.
And so you were doing that as early as age 18 on the air with an audience.
Oh, yeah. Well, younger than that, 16, 17 maybe.
Wow. And then from there you enlisted in the Army.
I enlisted for the draft as soon as I hit 18, because I could get my service out of the way and I could get on with my life. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, the draft was still in effect.
Yeah, the draft was in effect.
And you'd be better to control it yourself instead of let them.
Yeah, exactly. And I learned a lot in the Army. Boy, I don't regret those 2 years at all. I learned tolerance. I was thrown together with people I would never ordinarily meet in life. And And I was also determined. Everybody was bitching about going into service. And I swore to God I wasn't going to bitch. They could give me the most difficult KP or whatever it was. I did it. There was no way I was going to bitch. I was going to learn. I still learn. If I don't learn something new every day, it's a wasted day.
So the Army worked out really well for you then?
It really did, absolutely.
So first you went to Fort Ord, correct?
I went to Fort Ord, and I decided they wanted to put me in special services, but that would be a pain in the ass because that would mean that I'd have to work at night entertaining the troops. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to work off post, earning money that I could send home. So when I got to Tokyo, I got a job in a nightclub. Against it, I was making more than a general. I got court-martialed.
Really?
I got a summary court-martial. I lost my PFC rank and was dropped down to a private, and they sent my butt from Japan to Korea.
And that was because you were performing in nightclubs?
Absolutely. The general was not amused at that.
Not amused
I wasn't hurting anybody.
And
I was making money and sending it home. My family needed it.
And you were singing jazz standards, basically?
I was singing jazz and folk and all kinds of stuff.
For American GIs that would come into the...
No, I was singing for Japanese kabandagenza. There were very few GIs could afford it.
Really?
Some tourists, a lot of Japanese.
Wow, interesting. Now, when you were at Fort Ord, you wrote for the newspaper.
I wrote for, a little bit for the Stars and Stripes, but mostly I wrote for, well, eventually it wound up being KCAC, the Korean Civil Assistance Command. But what it was I wrote propaganda. I invented a character a la Tokyo Rose. Her name was Moran, and she spoke to the North Korean troops trying to get them to defect to South Korea. I wrote my things in English, and they were translated into Korean, and she spoke to them.
Really?
Yeah.
That's an interesting assignment.
So it was fun. I wrote the same kind of things I wrote for radio.
Wow. That's interesting.
I remember her opening line was, "Hello, my midnight companion. It's me, Moran, again. You ought to come south. It's beautiful here. Your family's here. Friends are here. I'm here."
Wow. I'm
writing for a woman.
I'm ready to go now.
But it was, I liked it. I'll never forget, though, those were weird times. I wrote we were headquartered in what's called the Finance Building at that time. This is after World War II. And so there was still a lot of American troops in Japan. And I remember the sergeant came by and I was thinking, I was sitting there in front of my typewriter, and he slapped me in the head and said, "Why aren't you creating?" I thought to myself, I got to get out of this. I've got to do something. I've got to get back to entertaining. And that's when I got the job performing.
In Japan?
In Japan. I was very fortunate. I never saw any active duty. The Korean War ended while I was still in basic, but it meant that I had to have 16 weeks of basic because instead of having 8 weeks of basic and going over as a GI and as a trooper or as an entertainer, if I was going to write, and be a part of the writing team, I had to spend that extra 8 weeks in New York. That was great. I used to second act all the shows. I'd go into New York and I saw everything. I saw every show. God, it was great.
Really?
Fantastic. Fantastic. I went to quiz shows and won money as this poor GI in my uniform, Always,
That's great.
things I never talked about to anybody.
Now, you self-published your first book around that time.
I did, just as I was going into the service.
And how did you finance that?
Friends, friends took up donation from friends. Cost about $750, a lot of money.
Yeah, back then, yeah.
And it came out. You can't get one for $750 now. No. Not that first edition of that.
How many did you publish? How many copies do you think?
I think it's only about maybe 500.
500 copies? How did you distribute it back then? What was the thought in your mind? Because it's a precursor to what you ended up doing.
Yeah, I thought I was a pretty good writer. And I thought I was writing in a way that nobody else was writing. And I thought, it belongs in a book. So I put it in a book. And it was years later before I wrote another book.
Yeah, about 12 years before
Stanley Street. And that was, I used to claim on the back of Glenn Yarborough's albums, on the back of my own albums, that these poems were from a book called Stanley Street and Their Sorrows. Well, no such book existed. But we started getting letters for people who wanted to buy the book. So I went home and wrote the book. That's what you do.
But so you published a book. It's really interesting to me that you self-published a book of your poetry. It's called And Autumn Came. After you got out of the Army, you went to San Francisco.
I went back to San Francisco. Jobs were pretty scarce there. San Francisco has really got it knocked. It's such a beautiful place. The wages aren't very good there. Finally, I went down to L.A. I thought, I'll go down to L.A. and try acting. Why not? So I got my first acting part by jumping on the back of a prop truck, getting on the Universal lot. I knew they were casting a teenage movie called Rock Pretty Baby, and I found out where the office was that they were doing it.
You hopped on the back of a property truck?
Yeah. Went through the gate. And I sat in the office all day, and the girl said, "What's your name again?" "Rob McKuen." "Must be there someplace." I don't think so. "But you've been here all day, and Ed Chevy will see you, sure." "You write songs? You sing too?" "Yeah, we'll put you in a movie, sure." They gave me a 7-year contract.
7-year contract with Universal?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so life wasn't all it was cracked up to be at Universal, because then things began to happen. People began to record my songs. I also began to appear on television shows and things like that. Now, Universal owned you. I was making $750 a week. Universal owned you, so they loaned you out. I was loaned out to Jack Benny for $5,000 a week, or to George Burns for $5,000 a week. They made the difference. I made $750. Plus, you had an 8-week hiatus when you were nothing. That wasn't right. So I made Rock Pretty Baby, then I made the sequel, which was called Summer Love. Then they decided they were going to elevate me, and I was going to be the star of the Western. This is the first time my name was over a title. I got third star billing. It was Reno Sullivan, who played my mother. Will Rogers Jr. played a friendly Callahan, Rod McKuen. In Wild Heritage, co-starring Casey Tibbs. Troy Donahue played a neighbor brother. George Foghorn Winslow was in it. I mean, and about that time, then they sent me, before the film was finally wrapped, the contract thing was beginning to come to an end anyway. I saw the writing on the wall. And I saw, as people's contracts expired, they were let go. We had 8 directors on that movie. It was a color CinemaScope movie, but it was a B movie nevertheless. Wild Heritage was made to be shown on the second part of a double bill. Then they sent me a script called The Haunted House on Hot Rock Hill. I wanted to get out of the contract so bad. I wanted to go to New York, and I wanted to write songs, and I wanted to sing at the Blue Angel, the Bonsoir. I wanted to be a supper club singer now. Now I had a taste of Hungry Eye and all the West Coast and all that kind of stuff.
Purple Onion.
Yeah. So I wrote 2 words on the script and sent it back to the front office. You can guess what the 2 words were. So they let me out of my contract. But, this is a big but, I couldn't act for anybody else. No other studio. No movies, no TV, no stage, nothing. I could sing, I could write songs, because they didn't have a contract with me on that. And that was tough, but that's all right. I got out of the contract. I still owe them a picture. They haven't been after me to do it.
And so you're suspended, basically. Your contract was suspended. And when you're suspended, you're not allowed to work as an actor.
No, and you draw no salary.
Film or TV.
Yep, nothing.
And so you went to New York and started singing in clubs?
Well, I first went and I I did anything to make money. I mean, I was a male hustler for men and women. I sold blood. I got about $10 a pint, which isn't very much. I passed out one day in Central Park because I sold too much blood. I went around to different places, they don't keep track of that stuff. I had a blue suit, and you could put on the blue suit, and you could go to a big hotel like the Waldorf Astoria. They'd have maybe 10 conventions a day in there. You'd walk in, you'd see a table with a bunch of badges on it. You'd put on a badge, you had your blue suit on, you'd walk in, you were a member of the group that was meeting. I ate hors d'oeuvres. I learned, because I caught ptomaine poisoning so many times, not to eat the fish in the morning or late afternoon. Not to eat the fish, period.
Really, that was your.
That was a good lesson, yeah.
Wow.
And then I wrote songs for publishers, and suddenly began to get songs published, and other people began to do them, and suddenly I was a songwriter and a singer.